What's happening? Who are you?
You're safe now. I pulled you away from a truck.
A blind woman stands her ground. See what the officer did in this incredible moment. Sarah Mitchell navigated the crosswalk at 5th and Main Street at 14:30 on Wednesday afternoon, her white cane sweeping confidently as she crossed during the walk signal. In 90 seconds, when Officer David Park witnessed a delivery truck bearing down on the woman who couldn't see it coming, his split-second decision would save a life and inspire a city. Sarah, 35, appears to be exactly what her white cane indicates, a blind pedestrian whose independence and confidence navigate urban streets with practiced ease. But beneath her calm exterior lies a remarkable woman whose courage in daily life will soon meet extraordinary circumstances, requiring heroism from an unexpected source. What happened at the busiest intersection in downtown would prove that heroism comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most incredible moments arise when duty meets humanity in ways that transform both lives and communities. Downtown Metropolitan Avenue, a bustling commercial district where pedestrian traffic mixes with delivery vehicles, city buses, and commuter cars, in patterns that create constant navigation challenges for disabled individuals whose mobility requires extra awareness from both themselves and surrounding drivers who often fail to notice or accommodate special needs. The intersection operates with standard traffic control systems, but recent construction has altered normal pedestrian routes while creating visual obstacles that make crossing more dangerous for people with disabilities who rely on consistent environmental cues for safe navigation. Urban law enforcement officers patrol high-traffic areas where their primary responsibilities include traffic control and public safety. But they rarely encounter situations requiring split-second decisions that could mean life or death for civilians whose disabilities make them vulnerable to hazards that able-bodied individuals could avoid through visual awareness. This setting represents the daily intersection where disability courage meets urban danger, creating situations where ordinary moments can become extraordinary when circumstances demand heroic action from those trained to protect and serve. Sarah lost her sight at age 12 due to complications from diabetes requiring complete adaptation to navigating world designed for sighted individuals. Her mobility training taught independence through white cane techniques and environmental awareness that enabled successful completion of college education and career as social worker specializing in disability advocacy. Sarah's daily commute involves complex urban navigation that most people take for granted, requiring constant attention to audio cues, traffic patterns, and spatial relationships that visual impairment makes essential for safe travel through environments that weren't designed with accessibility as primary consideration during urban planning and development. Sarah works as Disability Rights Coordinator for City Social Services, advocating for improved accessibility, while managing her own daily challenges that include transportation, navigation, and workplace accommodation that enables her professional contribution to community services. Her independence represents years of training and determination to live fully despite visual impairment that could limit activities if she allowed fear to restrict her mobility and engagement. Sarah's confidence in urban navigation comes from extensive practice and environmental familiarity. Though construction and changing conditions create ongoing challenges requiring adaptability and trust in community awareness, about pedestrian safety for disabled individuals. Despite her blindness, Sarah possesses exceptional spatial awareness and environmental assessment skills that enable accurate navigation through complex urban areas, where visual cues are unavailable, but audio and tactile information provide sufficient guidance for independent travel. Her greatest strength is maintaining confident mobility despite disability. That could easily justify avoiding challenging environments, demonstrating courage that inspires others facing similar limitations. Sarah's advocacy work utilizes personal experience with accessibility challenges to improve community awareness and infrastructure that benefits all disabled individuals who need supportive environments for independent living and professional contribution to society that values diverse capabilities and contributions. Sarah must navigate urban environments where her disability creates vulnerability to hazards that most pedestrians could avoid through visual awareness while maintaining independence that her advocacy work and personal dignity require despite safety risks that blindness cannot eliminate. The primary obstacle is environmental unpredictability that urban construction and changing traffic patterns create for disabled individuals whose navigation depends on consistent cues that city development often disrupts without adequate accommodation for special needs that accessibility requires. The stakes involve both immediate physical safety and broader disability rights. Sarah's continued independence demonstrates that blind individuals can participate fully in community life, while any accident could reinforce stereotypes about disability limitations that her advocacy work attempts to overcome through visible success and community education. This conflict represents the daily challenge facing disabled individuals whose courage to live independently requires constant vigilance against hazards that able-bodied society often creates without considering the impact on those who navigate differently. But Sarah's routine afternoon was about to become a moment that would test every assumption about vulnerability, heroism, and what it means to protect those who face the world with different kinds of courage. Sarah's afternoon commute from the social services office to her apartment required crossing the city's busiest intersection during peak pedestrian traffic, utilizing audio signals and environmental cues that had become second nature through years of urban navigation practice. Standard Wednesday crossing, Sarah thought while positioning herself at the corner to wait for the walk signal, her white cane identifying optimal crossing path, while audio traffic cues provided timing information that visual pedestrians absorbed automatically without conscious effort. The intersection represented both routine challenge and daily victory over limitations that blindness could impose if fear prevented independent travel through environments that required constant awareness and adaptive navigation techniques that mobility training had perfected. Officer David Park observed pedestrian traffic from his patrol position, noting the blind woman whose confident bearing suggested familiarity with the crossing. Despite construction zones that had altered normal traffic patterns in ways that could create hazards for disabled pedestrians. She crosses here every day, Park noted while recognizing Sarah's routine that demonstrated remarkable independence despite visual impairment that would challenge most people's willingness to navigate complex urban environments without assistance or fear of potential accidents. The routine moment was about to transform into crisis, requiring immediate action when urban traffic patterns created danger that neither Sarah nor surrounding pedestrians could anticipate or avoid through normal awareness. Sarah's crossing preparation involved standard mobility techniques that blind pedestrians utilized for safe navigation, listening for traffic patterns, identifying audio crossing signals, and using white cane to assess curb conditions and path obstacles that construction might have created. Her approach emphasized environmental awareness that compensated for visual limitations through enhanced attention to sounds, spatial relationships, and timing patterns that enabled accurate assessment of crossing conditions without relying on visual traffic monitoring that other pedestrians used automatically. Most critically, Sarah prepared for unexpected obstacles by maintaining flexible response strategies that could accommodate construction changes, traffic variations, or environmental conditions that might require route modifications or timing adjustments during crossing attempts. Her crossing technique included specific cane sweeping patterns that identified path obstacles while providing spatial orientation relative to curb edges, crosswalk boundaries, and potential hazards that construction or parked vehicles might create within pedestrian crossing areas. Sarah also prepared standard communication responses for situations where assistance might be offered by well-meaning citizens whose help could be appreciated when needed, but wasn't required for routine navigation that her training had enabled her to manage independently. Her daily crossing had become routine exercise in urban navigation skills, though construction and changing traffic conditions required constant attention to environmental variations that could affect crossing safety despite familiar intersection that she navigated successfully dozens of times per week. Sarah approached the intersection during peak afternoon pedestrian traffic, noting increased vehicle activity and construction noise that indicated ongoing roadwork had continued affecting normal traffic patterns since morning commute through same area. The audio crossing signal indicated safe crossing time, while Sarah's cane assessment confirmed clear path despite construction equipment that had been positioned near intersection during day's work activities that hadn't been present during morning navigation. Construction crews moved equipment, Sarah observed while adjusting crossing angle to accommodate changed environmental conditions that required adaptive navigation, despite familiar intersection that routine had made predictable under normal circumstances. Officer Park monitored intersection traffic from his patrol vehicle while noting Sarah's skilled navigation and confident crossing technique that demonstrated remarkable independence despite visual challenges that would intimidate most people attempting similar urban travel. The crossing began normally, with Sarah maintaining steady pace and proper cane technique, while audio cues provided timing information that enabled safe navigation despite construction changes that had altered some environmental landmarks she typically used for spatial orientation. Halfway across, Sarah mentally tracked her progress, while Officer Park continued routine traffic observation, both unaware that speeding delivery truck was approaching intersection during pedestrian crossing cycle when driver's attention was focused on GPS navigation rather than intersection safety requirements. But routine navigation was about to become life-threatening crisis when distracted driving met vulnerable pedestrian in circumstances requiring heroic action. Sarah's crossing proceeded normally until construction noise masked approaching delivery truck, whose driver was distracted by GPS navigation while accelerating through intersection during pedestrian crossing cycle, creating dangerous situation that visual pedestrians might notice, but Sarah couldn't detect through audio cues overwhelmed by machinery sounds. Her white cane provided spatial orientation but couldn't identify approaching vehicle threat. That normal crossing safety depended on driver compliance with traffic signals rather than pedestrian awareness of violations. Officer Park noticed truck's excessive speed while realizing driver hadn't seen pedestrian crossing signal, creating emergency situation requiring immediate intervention to prevent collision between distracted driver and vulnerable blind pedestrian who couldn't see approaching danger. The delivery truck continued accelerating toward intersection while driver remained focused on navigation system rather than traffic signals, creating imminent collision threat that Sarah couldn't detect due to construction noise overwhelming audio cues she relied upon for crossing safety. Park's training activated as he recognized emergency requiring immediate response to protect civilian whose disability prevented standard evasive action that visual awareness would enable other pedestrians to take when threatened by traffic violations. Sarah maintained normal crossing pace while unaware of approaching vehicle whose driver had failed to notice both traffic signal and pedestrian in crosswalk, creating crisis that required split-second decision-making from observing officer whose intervention could prevent tragedy. Officer Park faced critical decision as delivery truck approached Sarah's crossing path with insufficient time for standard traffic enforcement that would require stopping vehicle through audio warnings or positioning that wouldn't reach driver quickly enough to prevent collision. Sarah's continued progress through crosswalk placed her directly in truck's path, while construction noise prevented her from hearing approaching danger that visual pedestrians would notice and avoid through evasive action. Park's emergency response training indicated immediate physical intervention was necessary to remove Sarah from collision path. Since vehicle couldn't be stopped in time through conventional traffic control methods that required driver cooperation unavailable when distraction prevented awareness of emergency situation. The intersection crisis attracted attention from surrounding pedestrians, who began recognizing imminent collision between distracted truck driver and blind woman, whose vulnerability created emergency requiring immediate intervention from witnesses who lacked authority or positioning to respond effectively. Construction workers observed developing situation while their equipment noise had contributed to masking audio cues that Sarah needed for detecting approaching vehicle threat that normal crossing safety protocols couldn't address when traffic violations occurred during pedestrian crossing cycles. "Someone needs to help that woman," shouted nearby pedestrian while pointing toward Sarah's position in truck's path, but distance and traffic prevented civilian intervention that could reach her before collision occurred during time-critical emergency requiring professional response. Media crews covering construction story began documenting developing crisis, while Officer Park's radio communications requested emergency medical backup for potential pedestrian accident that his intervention might prevent if executed successfully within seconds remaining before impact. The convergence of distracted driving, construction noise, and pedestrian vulnerability created perfect storm requiring heroic action from law enforcement officer whose training and positioning enabled response that civilian witnesses couldn't provide despite recognizing emergency that demanded immediate intervention. Social media posting by witnesses began creating viral documentation of developing crisis that would either demonstrate successful emergency response or tragic failure of urban safety systems designed to protect vulnerable pedestrians. Facing immediate physical danger while unaware of approaching threat tested Sarah's daily courage in navigating urban environments where independence required constant trust in community safety systems and driver compliance with traffic regulations protecting pedestrian rights. The crisis situation revealed character developed through years of disability navigation. She maintained confident crossing technique despite changed environmental conditions, demonstrated trust in intersection safety, despite construction complications, and continued independent travel, despite risks that visual impairment couldn't eliminate. Her response to unknown emergency tested psychological resilience that blindness had developed through necessity, requiring adaptation to unexpected situations while maintaining dignity and independence that disability advocacy work had taught her to preserve despite challenges. The emergency crystallized Sarah's understanding of community interdependence. Independence didn't mean isolation from others' protective actions, while vulnerability could coexist with strength when supportive community members recognized opportunities to assist without diminishing personal autonomy. Sarah's daily navigation courage had prepared her for managing uncertainty, but crisis would test whether community support systems could protect those whose disabilities created vulnerability. Despite remarkable personal strength and environmental navigation skills that enabled independent urban living, her crossing technique remained steady, despite changed conditions, demonstrating determination to maintain normal activities, despite construction complications that could justify avoiding challenging environments if fear replaced courage in disability navigation decisions. As delivery truck continued approaching Sarah's crossing path, while construction noise prevented her awareness of imminent collision, the situation reached critical point where Officer Park's intervention would determine whether urban safety systems protected vulnerable community members effectively. Sarah's confident crossing pace indicated trust in intersection safety that driver distraction was about to violate, creating emergency that tested community responsibility for protecting those whose disabilities required supportive awareness from surrounding individuals and institutions. The truck driver's continued focus on navigation rather than intersection safety demonstrated failure of individual responsibility that created community emergency requiring collective response through available protective resources and personnel positioned to provide assistance. Officer Park's recognition of crisis created opportunity for demonstrating law enforcement commitment to protecting and serving vulnerable community members whose daily courage deserves supportive action during emergencies that tested community values and institutional effectiveness. The convergence of disability vulnerability driver negligence and law enforcement positioning created perfect conditions for testing whether protective systems functioned effectively when circumstances required heroic action to prevent tragedy, resulting from individual failure affecting community member whose independence deserved protection. And then everything changed when Officer Park's training met his humanity and split-second decision-making would determine whether Sarah's courage would be protected by community heroism. Officer Park's crisis reached its peak when he realized the delivery truck would strike Sarah within 3 seconds unless immediate physical intervention removed her from the collision path, forcing split-second decision between personal safety and civilian protection that defined law enforcement duty under extreme circumstances. No time for warnings. Park calculated while abandoning his patrol vehicle to sprint directly into intersection traffic, leaving safety of police car to position himself between approaching truck and vulnerable pedestrian who remained unaware of imminent danger. The situation exploded into pure emergency response as Park reached Sarah's position just as delivery truck entered intersection at dangerous speed, requiring immediate physical contact to move her from collision path while placing himself at risk of impact. "Ma'am, excuse me," Park announced while grabbing Sarah's arm to pull her towards safety. His sudden contact creating confusion for blind pedestrian who couldn't see approaching danger that required emergency intervention without time for explanation or consent. Sarah's startled response to unexpected physical contact triggered defensive reflexes, as she didn't understand the emergency requiring immediate relocation from crossing path she'd been navigating safely according to audio cues that construction noise had compromised. "What are you doing?" Sarah demanded, while resisting Park's emergency assistance, not knowing that truck driver's distraction had created collision threat, requiring immediate evasive action that her blindness prevented her from taking independently. The crisis had escalated beyond traffic control to life-saving emergency, where civilian protection required forcible intervention that proper procedure couldn't accommodate within time constraints that prevented explanation or obtaining consent for physical contact that emergency demanded. Standing in intersection traffic while delivery truck approached at high speed, Officer Park confronted fundamental choice between respecting Sarah's autonomy and forcibly moving her to safety despite her resistance to unexpected physical contact that emergency circumstances required without time for explanation. The safe choice was respecting her independence call-out warnings, trust her to respond appropriately, and avoid physical contact that could be construed as assault despite emergency circumstances that civilian couldn't see or understand without visual awareness of approaching threat. But Park realized that Sarah's blindness prevented her from detecting danger that required immediate evasive action, while truck driver's distraction created emergency, where civilian protection took precedence over procedural preferences that normal circumstances would allow. "If I don't act, she dies," Park thought, while truck approached their position. "If I do act, I'm violating her personal space and autonomy, but she'll live to understand why emergency required immediate intervention without consent." His decision crystallized around law enforcement duty. Protecting civilian life took precedence over personal autonomy, when emergency circumstances prevented informed consent for assistance that could preserve life, despite temporary violation of individual preferences. The ultimate stakes transcended individual choice to involve community protection, whether law enforcement would act decisively to save vulnerable civilians despite procedural complications, or whether respect for autonomy would prevent life-saving intervention during emergencies requiring immediate action. Park's choice would determine not just Sarah's survival, but broader understanding of protective duty. When disability created vulnerability that emergency circumstances couldn't accommodate through standard procedural approaches requiring time unavailable during crisis. Officer Park made the choice that would save Sarah's life while testing every boundary of appropriate emergency intervention, forcible protective action, despite her resistance to unexpected contact that emergency circumstances couldn't allow time to explain properly. "Emergency, ma'am, truck coming," Park shouted while physically lifting Sarah from crosswalk despite her struggle against unexpected contact, carrying her to sidewalk safety as delivery truck passed through space she'd been occupying seconds earlier. His transformation from traffic observer to emergency responder required split-second adaptation to crisis circumstances that training had prepared him for, but real-world application tested through adrenaline and time pressure that prevented ideal procedural compliance. But Park's intervention created new crisis as Sarah's shock at unexpected physical handling combined with confusion about emergency she couldn't see triggered emotional response to violation of personal space that disability made particularly sensitive. "Put me down. You have no right to grab me," Sarah protested while Park maintained protective hold until truck passed completely through intersection, his emergency action complete but emotional aftermath, requiring explanation and de-escalation. Park's courage in risking criticism to save civilian life had succeeded physically, but created psychological crisis requiring careful management to address Sarah's justified anger about unexpected physical contact that emergency had necessitated without proper consent or explanation. This was the moment where life-saving heroism met disability rights, and Park's explanation would determine whether emergency intervention became community inspiration or controversy. As Officer Park gently set Sarah down on the sidewalk while the delivery truck passed through the intersection where she'd been walking moments before, he prepared for explaining emergency intervention that had violated her personal autonomy to preserve her life during crisis she couldn't see. His approach required balancing respect for her justified anger about unexpected physical contact with explanation of immediate danger that had required forcible intervention without time for consent or warning that normal circumstances would have allowed. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Park with Metropolitan Police. I had to move you from immediate danger. Delivery truck was about to hit you during crossing. Driver was distracted and didn't see pedestrian signal or you in crosswalk," Park explained while maintaining respectful distance that acknowledged her autonomy. Sarah's processing of information required understanding emergency circumstances that her blindness had prevented her from detecting, while her emotional response to unexpected physical handling needed validation despite necessity of intervention that had saved her life. Gathering crowd of witnesses began confirming Park's account while providing external validation of emergency that Sarah's sensory limitations had made invisible to her awareness, despite immediate threat to her safety, requiring protective action. The aftermath required delicate management of Sarah's dignity while ensuring she understood circumstances that had necessitated emergency intervention, violating normal boundaries of personal space and autonomy. The moment after emergency intervention created intense emotional atmosphere as Sarah processed information about danger she hadn't detected while managing shock at unexpected physical contact. That disability made particularly violating despite life-saving necessity. "You grabbed me without permission," Sarah stated while struggling to understand emergency circumstances that justified violation of personal boundaries that blind individuals especially needed to maintain for psychological safety and dignity. Park's response demonstrated training in disability sensitivity. "Ma'am, I understand this was traumatic. Emergency circumstances required immediate action to prevent collision. I apologize for startling you. but truck driver didn't see you and was about to strike you in crosswalk. Witness testimony began supporting Park's account as bystanders described distracted driving and near collision that Sarah's blindness had prevented her from observing directly, creating external validation of emergency that her sensory experience couldn't confirm independently. The truck was coming right at you, confirmed construction worker whose machinery noise had contributed to masking audio cues that might have warned Sarah of approaching danger requiring evasive action. The convergence of Sarah's justified anger, Park's emergency justification, and witness testimony created complex situation requiring resolution that honored both disability rights and life-saving intervention while establishing precedent for future emergencies. Sarah's emotional processing began as witness accounts confirmed Officer Park's description of emergency intervention that her sensory limitations had prevented her from experiencing, directly creating cognitive dissonance between violation of autonomy and protection of life that required careful resolution. "I didn't hear any truck," Sarah acknowledged, while construction worker explained how machinery noise had masked approaching vehicle sounds that normally would have provided audio warning about traffic violations threatening pedestrian safety. Park's continued respectful explanation demonstrated understanding of disability sensitivity. "Your white cane navigation was perfect for normal conditions." Construction noise and driver distraction created circumstances that even experienced pedestrians couldn't have anticipated or avoided without visual awareness. The gathering crowd began recognizing heroic intervention as more witnesses described delivery truck speed and drivers' obvious distraction that had created emergency requiring immediate response to prevent collision that would have severely injured or killed pedestrian unable to detect approaching danger. Sarah's anger began shifting toward understanding as evidence accumulated about genuine emergency that had required protective action despite her preference for maintaining independence and controlling physical contact. That blindness made especially important for psychological safety. Sarah's processing created complications as her lifetime experience with disability discrimination made her suspicious of assistance that could mask condescension or assumptions about her capabilities, requiring careful distinction between emergency intervention and inappropriate assistance. "How do I know you're not exaggerating to justify grabbing a blind person?" Sarah challenged, while testing whether Park's actions represented genuine emergency response or misguided overprotection that disabled individuals frequently encountered from well-meaning but patronizing assistance. Park's response demonstrated authentic respect. "Ma'am, I understand your concern. Disability discrimination is a real problem, and you have every right to question my actions. Would you like witness contact information so you can verify emergency circumstances independently?" His willingness to provide accountability demonstrated genuine respect for her autonomy while maintaining that emergency circumstances had justified intervention that normal situations wouldn't require or permit from law enforcement or civilian assistance. Delivery truck driver approached intersection on foot after parking his obvious distress, confirming distraction that had created emergency. "I'm so sorry, I was looking at GPS and didn't see traffic signal or pedestrian. Officer saved your life." The driver's admission validated Park's emergency assessment while providing direct confirmation of circumstances that Sarah's sensory experience couldn't verify independently, despite their immediate threat to her safety. The climactic moment arrived when Sarah fully understood emergency circumstances while recognizing that Officer Park's intervention had demonstrated respect for her life and dignity. Despite temporary violation of autonomy, that crisis had necessitated without alternatives. "You really did save my life," Sarah acknowledged while processing driver's admission and witness testimony that confirmed genuine emergency, rather than misguided assistance that disabled individuals often faced from patronizing helpers who assumed incompetence. Park's response demonstrated continued respect. "Ma'am, your navigation skills are impressive. Emergency was created by driver error and construction noise, not anything you did wrong. You crossed this intersection safely every day today was unusual circumstances." His validation of her competence while explaining emergency circumstances created emotional resolution that honored both her independence and his protective duty during crisis that had required immediate intervention despite procedural complications. "Thank you for explaining and for getting witness information," Sarah said, while recognizing that Park's respect for her autonomy continued after emergency, demonstrating genuine disability awareness rather than assumptions about helplessness that often accompanied assistance. The driver's continued apologies and promise to improve attention while driving provided additional validation that emergency had been real and immediate, requiring intervention that standard crossing safety couldn't have prevented through individual awareness or navigation skills. Sarah's emotional journey from anger to gratitude demonstrated healthy processing of trauma while maintaining disability rights awareness that distinguished appropriate emergency intervention from inappropriate assumption of incapacity that she regularly encountered in non-emergency situations. Sarah's complete understanding created positive resolution as she recognized Park's professionalism while establishing precedent for respectful emergency intervention that honored disability rights within life-threatening circumstances requiring immediate protective action. Her public acknowledgement of Park's heroism validated appropriate emergency response, while her continued advocacy for disability awareness created educational opportunity for witnesses who observed respectful interaction between law enforcement and disabled civilian. Officer Park demonstrated perfect emergency response, Sarah announced to gathering crowd. He acted to save life while respecting dignity, explained circumstances, and provided accountability. This is how emergency intervention should work when disability is involved. The breakthrough extended beyond individual resolution to community education as Sarah's expertise in disability advocacy provided framework for understanding appropriate assistance versus discrimination that observers could apply in future situations. Her transformation from victim of emergency to educator about disability rights demonstrated remarkable resilience while creating positive outcome from traumatic circumstances that could have damaged trust between disabled community and law enforcement. Sarah's resolution with Officer Park created immediate positive impact as their interaction became model for respectful emergency intervention involving disabled individuals, while her advocacy expertise educated community about appropriate assistance versus discrimination. Park received commendation for life-saving intervention, while his respectful approach to disability sensitivity became training example for law enforcement dealing with vulnerable populations requiring emergency assistance. Most importantly, Sarah's public acknowledgement of appropriate intervention while maintaining disability rights advocacy created balanced understanding of emergency circumstances where protection and autonomy could coexist through respectful professional response that honored both safety and dignity. But Sarah's grateful recognition was just the beginning of transformation that would improve emergency response training and disability awareness throughout the entire community. Sarah's interaction with Officer Park triggered immediate policy development for law enforcement emergency response involving disabled individuals, as her expertise in disability advocacy, combined with his respectful intervention, created template for appropriate assistance that honored both safety and autonomy. The incident's documentation influenced police training programs, while Sarah's public endorsement of Park's actions demonstrated that emergency intervention could respect disability rights when properly executed with sensitivity and accountability that community oversight required. Park received departmental recognition, while his approach became standard training for officers encountering disabled civilians during emergencies requiring immediate intervention that traditional procedures couldn't accommodate within time constraints that crisis situations created. Sarah's continued advocacy utilized the incident as educational example of appropriate assistance versus discrimination, helping community members understand distinctions between emergency intervention and patronizing assumptions about disability that often complicated interactions between disabled individuals and service providers. Local disability rights organizations adopted the incident as case study for training emergency responders about respectful intervention techniques that preserve dignity while providing necessary assistance during circumstances requiring immediate protective action. 2 years later, Sarah's influence on emergency response protocols extended throughout the region as her advocacy work incorporated lessons from Park's intervention while developing comprehensive training for first responders encountering disabled individuals during crisis situations requiring immediate assistance. The Mitchell Protocol became standard emergency response procedure that balanced disability rights with safety requirements, creating framework for respectful intervention that maintained autonomy while providing necessary protection during circumstances that disabled individuals couldn't manage independently due to sensory or mobility limitations. Law enforcement academies incorporated disability sensitivity training, while emergency medical services developed communication techniques for explaining interventions to disabled individuals whose sensory limitations might prevent understanding of circumstances requiring immediate assistance. Urban planning departments began addressing intersection safety for disabled pedestrians, while construction protocols included provisions for maintaining audio cues that blind individuals required for safe navigation during infrastructure modifications that could affect accessibility. The case influenced federal accessibility guidelines while demonstrating that emergency intervention and disability rights could coexist through respectful approaches that honored individual autonomy within circumstances requiring immediate protective action for life preservation. Sarah evolved from emergency victim to recognized advocate whose experience with respectful intervention enhanced her disability rights work, while demonstrating that appropriate assistance could strengthen rather than undermine independence when delivered with sensitivity and accountability. Her relationship with law enforcement improved through Park's professionalism, while her advocacy gained credibility through first-hand experience with emergency circumstances that tested theoretical principles against practical life-saving requirements. Emergency intervention can respect disability rights when delivered with dignity and explanation. Sarah often teaches in training programs. Appropriate assistance enhances independence rather than diminishing it when provided with respect for autonomy and accountability for actions. Sarah's story proves that emergency intervention and disability rights can coexist through respectful approaches that honor autonomy while preserving life, demonstrating that appropriate assistance strengthens rather than undermines independence when delivered with sensitivity, explanation, and accountability that disability advocacy principles require. Today, Sarah Mitchell serves as Director of Emergency Response Accessibility Training, where her experience with Officer Park's life-saving intervention has influenced emergency protocols nationwide, while her continued advocacy ensures that disability rights and safety requirements complement rather than conflict with each other. Officer David Park became lead instructor for disability sensitivity training, while his respectful approach to emergency intervention continues serving as model for law enforcement academies throughout the country. The intersection where Sarah's life was saved now features enhanced audio signals and construction protocols that maintain accessibility during infrastructure modifications, while the incident became case study for urban planners designing disabled-friendly emergency systems. Sarah's advocacy work expanded to include emergency responder training, while her expertise helps first responders understand that appropriate assistance can enhance rather than diminish independence when delivered with dignity and respect. The delivery truck driver became advocate for distraction-free driving, while his experience demonstrates how individual responsibility affects community safety, particularly for vulnerable populations whose disabilities require heightened awareness from surrounding community members. Sarah's daily crossing of that intersection continues demonstrating remarkable independence, while her story proves that heroism and disability rights can coexist through respectful approaches that honor both safety and autonomy, creating communities where protection and independence strengthen each other through mutual respect and understanding that emergency circumstances require thoughtful response rather than assumptions about capability or helplessness that appropriate intervention can avoid through training that values dignity alongside life preservation.